All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're talking about a confession. But this isn't your typical crime story. This confession comes from a doctor, a man whose job it is to give names to things, specifically to our illnesses, a nomenclator.
So let's start with this quote that honestly messes with your head a little bit. It's from the man at the center of our story, Professor Émile Sorrentin. He said, "A name is not a discovery. A name is a creation." I mean, think about that. Isn't a doctor's entire job to discover what's wrong with us, not to create it?
And that strange idea leads us to the big, really unsettling question at the heart of all this. Can a name, just the act of putting a label on a bunch of symptoms, actually bring a disease into being?
Which brings us to this man, Professor Émile Sorrentin. We're talking about a top-tier neurologist, a 40-year career, famous for discovering a condition that's literally named after him. But at what he called his last lecture, he didn't do a victory lap. Nope. He got up there and confessed this deep, dark suspicion that he'd been wrestling with for decades.
You can just imagine the scene, right? As he's laying all this out, a hand shoots up in the audience, and someone asks the question that was on absolutely everyone's mind, the one you're probably thinking right now. So, are you saying you invented a disease?
But Sorrentin's answer, wow, that's what makes this so chilling. He doesn't say yes, he doesn't say no. He just says, I am saying something more disturbing than that. I am saying, I do not know. That uncertainty, coming from the one person who should know, that's the real bombshell.
And look, this wasn't just some vague feeling he had. He had data. This chart, it shows that after he and his colleague officially named Sorrentin-Mall syndrome, referrals for that exact illness shot up by a staggering 700% in just a year and a half. He said the name itself created a kind of gravity, just pulling all these vague symptoms into its orbit. All of a sudden, people didn't just have a tremor, they had his syndrome. And this goes way beyond a philosophical debate. It has these massive, real-world consequences for people. I mean, what does it actually feel like to be one of those patients, to be pulled into that orbit by a name? What happens when that label becomes a permanent part of who you are?
This is Lena Marvik. She was diagnosed with the syndrome, and she wrote a letter to Sorrentin that just perfectly nails this transformation. She said, I was a person with a tremor. After the diagnosis, I was a patient with a progressive neurological condition. These are not the same person. Her words really show you the power a simple name has to completely rewrite a life.
Marvik actually had a name for this. She called it the irreversibility thesis. The idea is basically this. Once you're put inside that diagnostic box, you can never really see yourself or your own body outside of it again. Every little twitch, every headache, it stops being a random thing. It's now a symptom. It gets filtered through this new lens, this diagnosis that you can't take off.
This really spells it out. Look at the left. Before the name, you just have a person with a collection of symptoms. A tremor, some headaches, maybe a facial twitch. They're just things that are happening. But then on the right, after the name gets slapped on, those separate things become one, single identity, a patient. A person's whole experience of their body just gets refiled into a new category.
Now here's the kicker. Lena Marvik wasn't just a patient. She was a brilliant mathematician, and she had an actual mathematical theory for this, something she called a generative category. And what is that? Well, it's a category that doesn't just go out into the world and find examples of itself. No, it actively generates them. The category literally creates the very thing it's supposed to be describing. Wild, right? So Sorrentin is haunted by all this. He's got his own decades of doubt, and now he's got Lena's theory. So he decides to do something, well, something pretty much unheard of. He decides to conduct a full census of his own creation. He was going to try and count every single person ever diagnosed with the syndrome to figure out once and for all if the disease created the patients or if the patients created the disease.
Of course, this created its own massive headache, a huge scientific problem that Lena called the Melee problem, named after Sorrentin's skeptical old partner. And the problem is this. Does the very act of trying to prove something, the measurement, the census itself, actually change the thing you're trying to measure? Can you ever get a clean look at it? And the scale of this whole thing was just huge. At that time, there were 4,217 people worldwide who had his name in their medical charts. That's not just a number. That's 4,217 individual lives that were defined in a very real way by this category that he had helped create.
Okay, so after months and months of work, the results came in, and they were just staggering.
First off, 16% were just flat-out errors. A massive 61% were diagnosed based on clinical judgment, which basically means they didn't quite fit the textbook definition. Only about 22% were a perfect match, diagnosed after the name was created. But the most important part of this whole chart is that tiny little sliver right there.
That sliver, that tiny 0.8%, was everything. Out of over 4,000 patients, the census could only find evidence of 34 people, 34, whose symptoms clearly existed before the syndrome ever had a name. The thing he discovered basically didn't exist until he gave it a word.
So what happens when you publish something like that? What's the fallout? When the guy who created a disease turns around and questions if it's even real? This is where the story shifts from this intellectual puzzle to just raw human impact. And the reaction was, well, it was chaos. Total chaos. Doctors were outraged because they felt like their professional judgment was being attacked. Philosophers of science were, totally thrilled. They saw it as proof of their theories. And the patients? They were just lost. Confused, distressed. Their entire identity had just been pulled out from under them.
And this quote from a patient named Claire DeBrade, man, it just says it all. She wrote to him, "You have removed the name, and without the name, I do not know what I am." For her and for so many others, that diagnosis wasn't a burden, it was a foundation. It was an answer. And Sorrentin had just taken a sledgehammer to it.
But here it is, the final, most mind-bending twist in this whole story. Sorrentin realized that even the doubt his census created was just being swallowed up by the syndrome itself. Now, patients had a new symptom to worry about, the uncertainty of their own diagnosis. As he put it, the category had metabolized its own critique. It was so powerful, so all-encompassing, that even questioning it just became another part of it.
And that's what we're left with. Sorrentin's story, his confession, it was about one single medical syndrome, but it really forces us to ask a much, much bigger question. If the simple act of naming something, of creating a category, can literally shape reality in this profound way, what else in our world? What other parts of our society, our culture, our own lives have our categories created?